wish to thank both the committee and Yara for deciding that my thesis was worth this and for inviting me here to present my work today. And I also wish to thank my supervisor, Professor Jakob Linder, without whom I would also not be standing here today. So thanks a lot. So I will now say a few words about my PhD thesis titled Manipulating Superconductivity in Magnetic Nanostructures in and Out of Equilibrium. So just to get started, I first want to say a little bit about why we are interested in superconductivity in the first place. So to start with a simple example, so if you take a normal conventional power source, for example a battery, and you hook it up to a normal metal, then generally the power source will force electrons to move through the system and hopefully do something useful on the way. So for example, if you take a metallic wire, for example a copper, and you coil it up like this, then the useful work would be that you can create a magnetic field, a so-called electromagnet, and just this one example alone has numerous applications such as powering MRI machines at every hospital, NMR machines for chemical analysis, controlling particle beams at the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, or stabilizing fusion plasmas in, for example, ITER in France. So the problem with doing this with a normal metal is that is electrical resistance. So basically, you will lose a lot of energy to electrical resistance, which basically goes into heating up the system. And in addition to the high power bill, what this will do is that it makes you require a very advanced cooling system in order to keep the system functioning. So that is where superconductors enter the picture. So superconductors have zero electrical resistance at very low temperatures. And then I don't mean like freezing temperature, but close to the absolute zero for most of them. But what this means is that you can sustain very high electric currents without the high energy loss conventionally associated with that. The other defining property of superconductors is the so-called Meissner effect. What happens then is that if you take a superconductor, here shown in yellow, and you put it in a magnetic field, here from a bar magnet, then the superconductor will spontaneously create an electric current, which produces an opposite magnetic field, and this both prevents the external magnetic field from entering the superconductor, and it physically pushes the magnet away. So this is quite strikingly shown in this picture of a superconducting cube hovering over a permanent magnet. And this, of course, inspires the imagination to think about levitating trains or other futuristic technology possibilities. So now I will jump a bit to what I have been doing during my PhD. So, as was mentioned a bit earlier, all of my PhD research was related to the topic of superconductivity, and during my time as a PhD, I worked on 16 peer-reviewed publications. 15 fit into the thesis, and the 16th came out a month later. So, these fall into 4 main categories and 2 minor categories. So the 4, I would say, are the main ones, would be how magnetic control, meaning how can you control superconductivity using magnets. Voltage control, which is how can you use voltages to push superconductors out of equilibrium and do useful things with them. Supercurrents, which is the study of these resistance-less electrical currents flowing in superconducting systems, and providing theoretical support for experiments. In addition, there are 2 minor topics that I worked briefly on, which is how superconductivity interfaces or is affected by microwaves and how it behaves in topologically non-trivial systems. So I will now talk a little bit about each of the major categories. So the first one, magnetic control, I will talk a bit about something which is based on these 3 publications. So one on the top left here from 2015 is the original theory paper where we predicted this effect and derived some equations required to analyze it. Then we had a spin-off theory paper in 2016 investigating other aspects of this device, and an experimental paper from 2018 where this was observed in the lab. And So first, just to give a brief background. So if you take a superconductor and you place it between two ferromagnets, in this case, the superconductor is supposed to be really thin, like 30 nanometers or something, then the ferromagnets might end up just killing all the superconducting properties entirely. So then the system looks more like this. The N here stands for non-superconducting or normal. However, if you manage to twist one of the magnets to point in the other direction, then actually the two magnetic fields cancel out near the center of the superconductor, and then superconductivity is restored. So this is not a new idea. This was proposed in the 60s and has been done experimentally for at least 20 years. But it's known as a superconducting spin valve. But one challenge experimentally is that trying to individually point two magnets in different directions, 20 nanometers apart, is not so easy. So what we did in our research was that we found a way to do the same using one ferromagnet instead of two. So this was done by placing an extra layer in between, a thin, like 1 to 2 nanometer thick layer of a heavy metal, such as platinum or gold. And I don't have time to go into full detail on how this works, but the short summary is that it's related to a relativistic effect known as spin-orbit coupling, which in this case causes some forms of superconductivity to be destroyed by the spin-orbit coupling, while other types of superconductivity are not. And then which direction the ferromagnet is pointing is then related to which types of superconductivity exist in this structure. But to summarize, this is then a new way, and hopefully a simpler way, to control superconductivity using magnetism that only requires you to control one magnet instead of two. So the next paper I will talk about was published in Nature Communications in 2017, and it's called Controlling Supercurrents and their Spatial Distribution in Ferromagnets. So this was experimental work done by collaborators at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And what they did in their lab was quite impressive. They made a disk of cobalt, which is a strong ferromagnet, and this disk geometry, here's a real picture of it, the disk geometry makes the magnetic field point around in a circle inside the magnet, a so-called vortex configuration. Then on top of this cobalt disk, they added a thin layer of copper, which is a normal metal, of nickel, which is another magnetic layer pointing in a different direction, and then on top is a thicker layer of niobium, which is a good conventional superconductor. And then they took an ion beam and they cut a trench through the device here. And what this meant was that the only way electrons in this half of the superconductor could end up in this half of the superconductor would be if the electricity flowed down into this magnetic vortex and moves a bit over here and comes back up on the other side. And this means that you can learn a lot about how superconductivity interfaces with magnetism in this kind of device by basically studying the current flowing down here and up here between the two halves of the superconductor. So in their experiment, they then did something called a quantum interference experiment, where they basically checked the electric current flowing between the two halves of the superconductor as a function of an applied magnetic field, which gave some figures that looked like this. Then we helped them associate this to theory and find out basically exactly where in their system would the supercurrents have to flow, which is, here's the spatial distribution we found, in order to produce the observed interference experiments. And then we did 3D numerical simulations of how superconductivity would have to, according to theory, should flow through the system and be converted into different types of superconductivity, which we compared to this experimental-based result. And this was then done to help provide a theoretical understanding of exactly what was going on in their physical system. The last paper I will talk about is my favorite paper from the PhD, called Voltage-Induced Thin-Film Superconductivity in High Magnetic Fields. So first, I will just say something briefly about superconductors in general, which is that they have something called an order parameter, or superconducting gap, and the strength of all superconducting properties can generally be related to this order parameter. So if this order parameter is high, then you can have large resistance-less currents flowing, etc. So and this can be measured experimentally. So if you look at the order parameter as a function of, for example, temperature, in general you will find something that looks like this. And then since superconductivity is related to having this order parameter, if it drops to 0, then the system is not superconducting. So based on this, you could say classify the system into a superconducting region and a normal metal region, which you could then call a phase diagram for the superconducting system. If you do the same, but add a bit of magnetism to the system, either by attaching a ferromagnet or by applying an external magnetic field, you would get something like this. So this is not a new result. This was done in the 1960s originally. And perhaps not surprisingly, if you have low temperature and low magnetic field, you have superconductivity. If you go to high magnetic field and high temperature, you don't. And there's a more complex region here where the system is bistable, which means that you have something similar to hysteresis, but I will not go into detail about that now. Then here's another system, a superconductor with two insulating interfaces, two normal metals, with a voltage bias applied. It looks completely different, and the physics appears to be completely different. And then when you do the simulations, you get exactly the same picture. So this was quite surprising, and to be honest, when I first found out, I thought I had a bug in my code, but I didn't. And after digging a bit into the literature, I found out that someone else noticed the same back in 2010, and could show mathematically how the two seemingly very different systems were related to each other. But what they didn't do in that paper was to consider what happens if you have both. So we tried looking into that, having both the voltage bias and the magnetic field. So we looked at it both analytically and numerically. And then we found this. So this plot is for at 0 absolute temperature, but at slightly higher temperature, the picture looks similar. So what you see here is a phase diagram as a function of magnetic field and voltage. And according to the more classical results, if you go along 0 voltage, you find that for high magnetic fields, superconductivity disappears. Similarly, if you hold the magnetic field to 0 and you go up along the voltage axis, then superconductivity disappears. But what's really interesting is that there's a line of stability in between, where if the voltage bias and the magnetic field increase at just the right rate compared to each other, then superconductivity is actually stabilized. Now this is very interesting for two different reasons. The first one is fundamental. There's a classical result from 1962 called the Chandrasekhar-Clarkson limit, which says that you cannot stabilize conventional superconductivity in magnetic fields that are higher than the superconducting order parameter. That would be this line. So what we did here was that we found a loophole in this classic result, showing that indeed you can stabilize superconductivity over in this region, as long as you apply a voltage bias in just the right way. The second conclusion is that this can potentially be quite useful in the future electronics devices, because if you now imagine that you hold the magnetic field fixed, for example at 1 in these units, then you increase the voltage, then suddenly superconductivity appears. And superconductivity appearing would mean that suddenly you would get a very large electrical current, because the resistance, you can have a resistance-less current flowing through the system. So this behavior is quite similar to a transistor, which is used in all classical computing. You can use a voltage to turn on or off a very large current, in this case a supercurrent. So this has potential applications for future superconducting computers. So finally, I want to say a little bit about how we arrived at these results, not in so much detail. Basically, all of my PhD was about solving this equation, which looks quite cute and compact, but it is not. This G is an 8x8 matrix filled with functions of position and energy. The sigma over here is a nonlinear function of the G. And then you have some covariant derivatives in there, which have some matrix commutators. The boundary conditions are quite ugly as well, and they originally took A4 page, so this is how it looks after working a lot on them. So in general, it's quite ugly equations. So a big part of my PhD, I would say maybe a third of the work, was to create a numerical program which can take a simple text file that looks somewhat like this, that specifies how a physical system looks, translates that into the equations I just showed you, and solves them in an efficient way numerically. And then this code was put online on GitHub as open source software, which means that any other researcher in the field is free to download the code and use it for their own simulations. And if they want, modify it as they see fit. So I must admit that I don't know exactly how many are using it, but I know at least that 2 groups have been contacting me by email to ask for instructions. Okay, so that was it for me.